At its height, the British Empire controlled nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and ruled over hundreds of millions of people. It was so vast that people proudly said, "The sun never sets on the British Empire," because somewhere in the world, the sun was always shining on British-controlled territory. From India to Africa, from the Caribbean to the Middle East, Britain's influence stretched across continents. But the real story of how that empire was built, and what it left behind, is far more complicated than patriotic slogans or simplified textbooks suggest. The British Empire did not expand purely through open warfare. In many cases, it began with trade. Merchants arrived first, not soldiers. Perhaps the most famous example is the East India Company, a trading corporation that entered India as a commercial enterprise. It negotiated trade deals, built ports, and slowly embedded itself into local politics. Over time, business interests turned into political control. Political control turned into military dominance. After the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the British Crown took direct control, and India became known as the jewel in the crown of the empire. Yet beneath that glittering title lies a harder question. Before British dominance, India was one of the world's largest economies, producing textiles and goods that were traded globally. Over the course of colonial rule, traditional industries declined, economic structures were reshaped, and wealth flowed outward toward Britain. By the time independence arrived in 1947, India's share of global economic output had dramatically fallen. Some historians argue this was the inevitable shift of global industrialization. Others see it as a clear case of systematic extraction. The debate continues, but the economic transformation is undeniable. The human cost of empire becomes even more visible when examining famine. During British rule, India experienced several devastating famines. The Bengal famine of 1943 remains one of the most controversial. Millions died amid wartime shortages, policy failures, and contested political decisions. Critics have long debated the role of British leadership during this crisis, including the actions and statements of Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Supporters argue the famine occurred under extreme wartime conditions. Critics argue imperial priorities worsened the catastrophe. What remains beyond dispute is the scale of suffering. Africa tells a similar story of strategic control. During the late 19th century, European powers met at the Berlin Conference and divided African territories among themselves. African leaders were not invited. Borders were drawn across maps with little regard for ethnic, cultural, or historical realities. Many of today's political tensions and conflicts in parts of Africa trace their roots back to these artificial boundaries. Colonial rule did not simply control land, it reshaped political futures. Resistance was common, and often suppressed. In Kenya during the 1950s, the Mau Mau uprising challenged British rule. The response involved detentions, camps, and later investigations into abuses. Decades afterward, legal cases forced public acknowledgement of mistreatment. These events complicate any simple narrative of empire as purely benevolent or purely evil. Power, when challenged, tends to defend itself forcefully. Defenders of the empire often point to infrastructure, railways, administrative systems, legal frameworks, global trade routes, and the spread of the English language. It is true that railways were built across India and Africa. It is true that governance systems were established. But intent matters. Many of these systems were designed primarily to facilitate the efficient movement of goods, troops, and resources, often toward British economic centers. Infrastructure existed, but it often served imperial priorities first. By the 19th century, Britain had become the world's leading industrial power. Its navy dominated global waters. London became the center of finance. Factories thrived. But much of the raw material fueling that growth came from colonies: cotton from India, minerals from Africa, sugar from the Caribbean. The empire was not simply a political project, it was an economic engine. And engines of that size inevitably reshaped global inequality. Then came the 20th century. 2 world wars strained Britain economically and militarily. Anti-colonial movements grew stronger. Nationalist leaders demanded independence. One by one, colonies broke away. India gained independence in 1947. African nations followed throughout the 1950s and 1960s. The empire gradually dissolved, replaced by a commonwealth of independent states. Yet the end of formal empire did not erase its legacy. Borders remain. Not just lines on maps, but lines that still divide ethnic groups, economies, and political stability across entire continents. In many regions, conflicts today can be traced back not to ancient history, but to decisions made in colonial offices thousands of miles away, by people who would never live with the consequences. Economic disparities persist. Some nations that were once heavily colonized still struggle with systems of trade and debt structure during imperial rule. Others remain deeply tied to global markets built during that era, markets they did not design, but now must operate within. English remains a global language. Not because it was naturally chosen by the world, but because it was carried through administration, education systems, and global institutions established during imperial expansion. Today, it is the language of diplomacy, science, business, and the internet, connecting the world, but also reflecting a specific historical pathway of dominance. Legal systems, administrative structures, and trade networks across dozens of countries still reflect colonial foundations. In courts, in government frameworks, in financial systems, echoes of empire still operate quietly in the background of modern life, often unnoticed because they have become normalized. The empire may have fallen. But structurally, it never fully disappeared. It evolved. So the question is no longer whether the British Empire ended. It clearly did. The real question is what it left behind, and whether the modern world has truly moved beyond it, or simply inherited its framework in a different form. So how should the British Empire be remembered? As a civilizing force that spread infrastructure, governance systems, and global trade networks across continents that were previously disconnected? Or as a calculated system of extraction, where wealth, resources, and labor flowed in one direction, reshaping entire economies around external demand rather than local development? Or perhaps something more uncomfortable than either narrative allows? A mixture. A system driven by ambition, innovation, and expansion, but also shaped by exploitation, imbalance, and consequences that extended far beyond intention. History rarely fits into clean moral categories. And the British Empire is one of its most complex examples. It created railways, but also restructured economies around extraction. It connected continents, but also divided communities. It built institutions that still function today, but often within frameworks it designed for its own advantage. It industrialized Britain at unprecedented speed, while simultaneously destabilizing regions that are still recovering from those disruptions in different ways today. It expanded global communication and trade. But it also concentrated wealth and decision-making power in ways that reshaped global inequality for generations. And this is where history becomes uncomfortable. Because the same systems that are often praised for modernization, are the same systems that, in other contexts, are criticized for control. Both can be true at the same time. The British Empire was not a single story. It was a network of overlapping realities, economic, political, cultural, and human, all unfolding simultaneously across continents. So when we look back at it, we are not just studying the past. We are examining the foundation of the present world itself. The sun may have set on the British Empire, but the world it helped shape is still running on its afterglow. And the question that remains is not just what it was, but how much of what we call modern global order is still quietly built on it.